It was just a standard military portrait, but the look in his eyes revealed he knew exactly what was coming. The photograph had been stored in a cardboard box at the Imperial War Museum in London for 79 years. It arrived in 1945 as part of a collection of German military documents seized by British forces after the fall of Berlin. Thousands of photographs, personnel files, and operational records documenting the Wehrmacht's final years. Dorani, Helen Garrett, a military historian specializing in World War II to German forces, discovered the photograph on a humid afternoon in July 2024. She was researching a project on German soldiers who had attempted to resist Nazi orders from within the military, and a colleague had suggested she examine the unprocessed materials from the Berlin archives. The photograph was unremarkable at first glance. It showed a Wehrmacht officer in full uniform, standing at attention against a plain wall. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with light hair and sharp features. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, his expression neutral in the way military portraits demanded. But his eyes told a different story. Helen had examined thousands of military portraits during her career, and she had learned to read the subtle variations in expression that photographers couldn't quite erase. Most soldiers looked proud, determined, or simply blank, fulfilling the requirements of a formal photograph. This man's eyes held something else entirely: knowledge, resignation, a kind of quiet acceptance that made Helen pause. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Hauptmann Ernst Müller, 336th Infantry Division, photographed October 18th, 1944, Berlin. And below that, in different handwriting, much smaller, executed October 20th, 1944, traitor. 2 days. The photograph had been taken 2 days before this man's execution. Helen's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Within hours, 2 colleagues had joined her in the archive reading room. Dr. James Patterson, an expert on German military justice during World War II, stood closest to the photograph, his reading glasses reflecting the overhead lights. Beside him, Dr. Margarete Weber, a German historian who specialized in Wehrmacht resistance movements, was already pulling up databases on her laptop. Hauptmann is equivalent to captain, Margaret noted. And the 336th Infantry Division, that unit was involved in heavy fighting on the Eastern Front before being pulled back to Germany in late 1944. James was searching through records of military executions. October 1944 was a critical time. The war was clearly lost, but Hitler was executing anyone suspected of defeatism or conspiracy. After the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler failed, paranoia within the Wehrmacht reached insane levels. "Look at his face," Helen said quietly. "Really, look at it. He knows he's going to die. This isn't a standard portrait. This is a condemned man being photographed for the record." They spent the rest of that day searching through German military archives for any reference to Ernst Müller. The Wehrmacht had been meticulous about documentation, and much of it had survived the war. By evening, they found his service record. Ernst Müller, born March 12, 1919, in Munich. Drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1939. Served with distinction in France, the Balkans, and Russia. Promoted to Hauptmann in 1943 after exemplary service during the retreat from Stalingrad. Awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. No disciplinary issues until October 1944. Then, abruptly, the record changed tone. Arrested October 17, 1944, on charges of defeatism, conspiracy to undermine military morale, and refusal to obey orders. Court-martialed October 19, 1944. Found guilty. Sentenced to death by firing squad. Sentence carried out October 20th, 1944. 0600 hours, Plötzensee Prison, Berlin. 25 years old, Margaret said softly. He was 25 years old. What did he do? Helen wondered aloud. What could a captain do in October 1944 that would get him executed within 3 days of arrest? James found the answer in a different archive, the records of the Wehrmacht military court system. The brief trial transcript had survived, buried in boxes of similar cases. The charges were clear. Hauptmann Ernst Müller had refused to execute a direct order from his commanding officer to shoot 15 civilian hostages in a Polish village during a retreat action. When ordered a second time, Müller had not only refused, but had helped the civilians escape, and had attempted to convince other officers in his unit to stand down. He saved civilians, Helen said, reading the transcript. While the Wehrmacht was collapsing, while Berlin was giving increasingly brutal orders to slow the Allied advance through terror, this man chose to save 15 Polish civilians instead. The trial transcript was chilling in its brevity. Müller had not denied the charges. According to the record, when asked if he understood that refusing orders during wartime was treason, he had simply replied, "I understand that obeying that order would have been murder. I am a soldier, not an executioner." He had been sentenced within minutes of the trial's conclusion. The photograph was taken the day after his trial, James noted. Standard procedure was to photograph condemned prisoners for the record, usually just for administrative purposes, to document that the sentence had been carried out properly. But look at him, Helen insisted. He's not just posing for an administrative photograph. He's bearing witness. He's making sure there's a record that he existed, that he made this choice. Margaret had been researching the 336th Infantry Division's movements in October 1944. His unit was retreating through Poland, being pushed back by the Soviet advance. The Wehrmacht was ordered to implement scorched earth policies, destroy everything, terrorize civilians to slow partisan activity, take hostages. It was a nightmare. And Ernst Müller said no, Helen added. At a time when saying no meant immediate execution, he said no. Finding more information about Ernst Müller proved difficult. Unlike high-ranking officers or famous resistance figures, ordinary captains who had been executed for treason left little trace in the historical record. But Helen was determined. She began contacting archives in Germany, searching for any personal documents, letters, or family records. The breakthrough came from the Munich City Archives. A woman named Anna Müller had donated a collection of family papers in 2003, including letters and photographs from her uncle, Ernst Müller. The archivist who responded to Helen's query noted that Anna Müller was still alive, now in her 80s, living in a care facility near Munich. Helen traveled to Germany the following month. Anna Müller was a small, sharp-eyed woman who remembered her uncle clearly, despite the 8 decades that had passed. Ernst was my father's younger brother, Anna explained in German, which Margaret translated. I was only 6 years old when he died, but I remember him. He was kind. He would bring me sweets when he came home on leave, even though sweets were nearly impossible to find during the war. He never spoke about the fighting, but I remember my parents worrying about him constantly. Anna produced a box of letters that Ernst had sent home throughout the war. Helen and Margaret spent hours reading through them, watching Ernst Müller's perspective shift as the war progressed. The early letters from 1939 and 1940 were optimistic, even enthusiastic. A young man proud to serve, believing in the cause, confident in Germany's strength. By 1942, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, the tone had changed. The letters became shorter, less frequent, filled with vague references to difficulties and harsh conditions. Ernst stopped mentioning politics or ideology, focusing instead on personal matters, asking about family, reminiscing about Munich, expressing hope that the war would end soon. The letters from 1943 and 1944 revealed a man in crisis. Though he was clearly careful about what he wrote, knowing military censors read all correspondence, Ernst's growing disillusionment was evident between the lines. One letter from March 1944 stood out. I have seen things that I cannot write about, things that no soldier should be asked to do. I wonder sometimes what we are fighting for anymore. The officers speak of duty and honor, but there is no honor in what I have witnessed. I pray this ends soon, before there is nothing left of the country or the men we once were. He knew what was happening, Helen said quietly. He saw the atrocities, and they were destroying him. The final letter Ernst had sent home was dated October 10th, 1944, 1 week before his arrest. Anna kept it in a separate envelope, and her hands shook as she handed it to Margaret to read. My dearest family, I write to you knowing this may be the last letter you receive from me. I have been ordered to do something unconscionable, and I find I cannot. I have carried out many orders during this war that I regret, orders I will have to answer for to God and to my own conscience. But there are some lines that, once crossed, destroy whatever remains of our humanity. I have decided I will not cross this line. Whatever consequences follow, I accept them. Please know that I love you all, and that I tried, in the end, to do what was right. Your son and brother, Ernst. Anna was crying softly. It arrived 3 days after we received the telegram saying he had been executed. My mother collapsed when she read it. My father was forbidden to speak about it, acknowledging that Ernst had been executed for treason could have endangered the whole family, so we pretended he had died honorably in combat. We lied for decades. You don't have to lie anymore, Helen said gently. Ernst Müller did die honorably. He died because he chose humanity over orders, conscience over obedience. Anna pulled out one more item from the box, a photograph. It was the same image Helen had found in London, but this copy had been sent home to the family. On the back, Ernst had written a brief message. October 18th, 1944. Whatever comes next, remember that I chose this. I was not broken. I chose. With love always, Ernst. Helen felt tears in her eyes. He knew when this photograph was taken that he was going to die. And he wanted his family to know it was his choice, his decision to refuse the order. He didn't want them thinking he had been captured or killed by the enemy. He wanted them to know he chose this. My mother kept this photograph hidden for 50 years, Anna said. After my father died in 1994, she finally showed it to me and told me the truth about what happened. But she made me promise never to speak about it publicly. She was afraid, even decades later, of the shame, the judgment. People still believed the Wehrmacht had been honorable, that the regular army had been separate from the Nazi crimes. Speaking about an executed traitor felt dangerous. But Ernst wasn't a traitor, Margareta said firmly. He was one of the few who had the courage to resist when it mattered most. James had been researching the incident that led to Ernst's arrest. He found a report filed by Ernst's commanding officer, Major Klaus Brenner, dated October 17, 1944. The report was coldly bureaucratic, listing Ernst's refusal to carry out the execution order and his act of helping the civilians escape. But there was one line that made them all pause. Hauptmann Müller stated that he would rather face execution himself than murder innocent civilians. His defiance was witnessed by multiple soldiers and represented a severe breach of discipline that could not be tolerated. Other soldiers saw him refuse, James noted. He didn't do this privately. He made his refusal public, in front of his men. That's what made it unforgivable to the command structure. He was setting an example of disobedience. An example of conscience, Helen corrected. In a system built on blind obedience, one man's conscience was a threat to the entire structure. They spent another week in Germany, searching for anyone who might have served with Ernst or witnessed the incident. Most of the 336th Infantry Division had been killed in the final months of the war, but James found a reference to one survivor, a former private named Wilhelm Koch, now 98 years old, living in a nursing home in Frankfurt. Wilhelm Koch was frail, but mentally sharp. When Helen showed him the photograph of Ernst Müller, the old man's eyes filled with tears. Hauptmann Müller, he whispered. I never forgot him. He was the only officer who treated us like human beings instead of expendable tools. Wilhelm described the incident in October 1944. The unit had been retreating through a Polish village when Major Brenner ordered them to round up civilians as hostages. 15 people, men, women, elderly, were to be shot as reprisal for partisan activity, though there had been no partisan activity in the area. Hauptmann Müller stood between the major and the civilians, Wilhelm recalled. He said the order was illegal, that executing hostages violated military law and basic humanity. The major screamed at him, threatened him with court-martial. Müller didn't move. He just said, "Then court-martial me. I will not murder these people." What happened next? Helen asked gently. The major ordered other officers to carry out the execution, but Hauptmann Müller had already ordered several of us to escort the civilians away, to help them escape into the woods. By the time the major realized what was happening, the civilians were gone. The major was furious. He had Müller arrested immediately. Wilhelm paused, his voice breaking. Some of us tried to speak up for him at the trial, tried to say he had only been following proper military law, that the execution order itself had been illegal, but they wouldn't hear it. The war was lost. Everyone knew it, but they were still killing anyone who acknowledged reality. "Did you see him again after the arrest?" Margareta asked. Wilhelm nodded. "Once. The day they took him to Berlin for execution. We were lined up to watch as they loaded him onto the truck. It was meant to intimidate us, to show us what happened to disobedience. But Hauptmann Müller looked at us, and he smiled. Actually smiled, as if he was at peace with what he'd done. That image has stayed with me for 80 years. The team returned to London with copies of all the documents, letters, and testimonies they had gathered. Helen began preparing a comprehensive article for publication, but she knew this story needed to reach beyond academic journals. The Imperial War Museum agreed to create an exhibition centered on Ernst Müller's photograph and story. Helen worked with Anna Müller to compile materials: the photograph, Ernst's letters home, the trial transcript, Wilhelm Koch's testimony, and documents about the broader context of Wehrmacht resistance. The exhibition opened in January 2025. The photograph of Ernst Müller was displayed prominently, enlarged so that visitors could see his face clearly, could look into his eyes and see what Helen had seen: knowledge, acceptance, quiet defiance. The exhibition text explained, this photograph was taken 48 hours before Hauptmann Ernst Müller was executed by firing squad for refusing to murder 15 Polish civilians. In his eyes, we see a man who knew his choice would cost him his life, and who made that choice anyway. In an army built on obedience, Ernst Müller's conscience was his final act of resistance. The response was overwhelming. The exhibition drew thousands of visitors in its first month. News outlets across Europe covered the story. Historians began searching for similar cases of Wehrmacht soldiers who had been executed for refusing atrocity orders, finding dozens of previously overlooked examples. But the most meaningful response came from Poland. A researcher named Katarzyna Nowak contacted the museum after seeing news coverage of the exhibition. She represented a village called Lipnica in eastern Poland, where her grandmother had lived during the war. "My grandmother told us a story for years," Katarzyna wrote. In October 1944, German soldiers came to the village and rounded up 15 people, including my grandmother's sister. They were told they would be shot as hostages. But then, a German officer refused the order and helped them escape into the forest. The villagers never knew his name. They called him the Angel in Grey because of his uniform. Could this be the same man? Helen traveled to Lipnica with Margaret and Anna Müller. The village had erected a memorial years earlier to the victims of Nazi occupation, including a plaque mentioning the mysterious German officer who had saved 15 lives. Katarzyna's grandmother, Maria Nowak, was 96 years old, but remembered the incident vividly. When Helen showed her Ernst Müller's photograph, the old woman gasped. "That's him!" she said in Polish, which Katarzyna translated. "That's the officer who saved us. I remember his face." He looked so young, but his eyes were old, tired. When he told us to run, he said, "Go quickly. I cannot stop them for long, but I can give you time." We ran, and we lived. Because of him. Anna Müller was crying. "My uncle saved your family." "He saved 15 families," Maria replied. 15 people who went on to have children and grandchildren. Because of one man's courage, we exist. The village of Lipnica held a ceremony to formally honor Ernst Müller. They added his name to the memorial, changing the inscription from Unknown German Officer to Hauptmann Ernst Müller, 1919-1944, who chose conscience over orders. Anna Müller unveiled a plaque that read, "Ernst Müller gave his life so that others might live. In refusing to commit murder, he reclaimed his humanity and honored the best of what it means to be human." Descendants of the 15 people Ernst had saved attended the ceremony. Over 80 people whose existence could be traced directly to his choice on that day in October 1944. They stood together, representatives of the life that had continued, because one man had said no. Helen stood before the memorial and thought about the photograph that had started this journey. Ernst Müller's eyes, looking directly at the camera, knowing he would die but showing no regret. He had understood what his choice would cost, and he had made it anyway. The story went viral within days. Social media filled with discussions about conscience, obedience, and the choices individuals make in systems designed to suppress moral agency. The photograph became one of the most shared historical images of the year, used in ethics classes, military training programs, and human rights discussions. In Germany, the story sparked renewed conversations about Wehrmacht culpability and resistance. For decades, many Germans had maintained that ordinary soldiers had simply been following orders, that resistance had been impossible. Ernst Müller's story challenged that narrative. He was an ordinary officer, Margaret explained in a television interview. Not a high-ranking general with political connections, not a member of an organized resistance movement. Just a captain who in one moment chose humanity over obedience. And he paid the ultimate price for that choice. The German government, after decades of refusing to exonerate Wehrmacht soldiers executed for treason, reconsidered Ernst Müller's case. In November 2025, he was officially pardoned, his execution declared unjust, his military honor restored. But perhaps the most powerful tribute came from an unexpected source. The German army, the modern Bundeswehr, created an annual award called the Ernst Müller Courage Award, given to soldiers who demonstrate moral courage in difficult circumstances. The first award was presented to a Bundeswehr officer who had refused to participate in a training exercise he believed violated international humanitarian law. Accepting the award, the officer said, "Hauptmann Müller showed us that orders are not absolute, that conscience must sometimes override obedience, and that true courage is not just facing the enemy, but facing the consequences of doing what is right." Helen published her comprehensive research in 2026, and the book became an international bestseller. But she always maintained that the most important aspect of the story was the photograph itself. "When you look at Ernst Müller's face," she said during book tour interviews, "you're seeing a man who has made peace with his decision. He's not angry, not desperate, not pleading. He's calm, because he knows that in refusing to murder innocent people, he reclaimed something essential about himself. In a system designed to turn men into killers, he chose to remain human. And he wanted that choice documented, witnessed, remembered." Anna Müller lived to see her uncle's story told, and his name cleared. She died in 2027 at the age of 89, and requested that Ernst's photograph be buried with her. At her funeral, representatives from Lipnica attended, carrying a wreath with 15 white roses, one for each life Ernst had saved. The photograph remained at the Imperial War Museum, but copies were displayed at the Lipnitzer Memorial, at the Munich City Archives, and at the Bundeswehr Military History Museum. Each display included Ernst's own words from the back of the photograph. "Whatever comes next, remember that I chose this. I was not broken. I chose." 80 years after Ernst Müller faced a firing squad for refusing to commit murder, his eyes still looked out from that photograph, bearing witness to a simple truth, that even in humanity's darkest moments, individuals can choose conscience over compliance, humanity over horror, life over death. He knew what was coming. The photograph captured that knowledge, but it also captured something else. The quiet dignity of a man who had chosen to save lives at the cost of his own, and who faced death without regret. Ernst Müller's story became a reminder that history is made not just by those who follow orders, but by those brave enough to refuse them. That true courage sometimes means standing alone against the machinery of evil. And that one person's choice, captured in a single photograph, can echo across generations. His eyes revealed he already knew, and in choosing anyway, he gave the world a lesson in conscience that would outlive the regime that killed him, outlive the war that destroyed millions, and outlive the silence that had hidden his story for 80 years. The photograph remained, a testament to one man's refusal to become what his uniform demanded, and his insistence on remaining until his final breath, simply and powerfully human.